In part, thanks to their ability to heal, Jesus and the disciples began to attract larger and larger crowds. But for all the good work the disciples did, healing could be a deeply frustrating experience. The Bible tells us that sometimes they just couldn't do it.
In the Gospel of Matthew, there's a story of a man who brings his son to Jesus, and the son is exhibiting symptoms we would call epilepsy. And he complains the disciples had failed to heal his son. Well, Jesus does heal the son. Later on, the disciples come and say, well, why couldn't we do it? What was the problem? And Jesus says, it was your lack of faith.
The reference to the disciples' lack of faith rings true with modern doctors. Physician Bruce Moseley believes that even today, the amount of confidence a doctor has in his treatment can affect the outcome.
If the surgeon has a high expectation and a faith that their treatment's going to have a benefit, then I believe that the patients can realize that, they can feel that, they can sense that. And the more confident the surgeon is, then I'm sure the more confident the patient is that that treatment's going to work.
But the disciples' occasional inability to heal may have been symptomatic of a more fundamental problem. To have complete faith in Jesus as a leader, the disciples needed to share his vision, and for much of the time they appeared to do so. But a closer examination of the Gospels reveals that the disciples did not always have the same outlook as their leader. Indeed, there's evidence of underlying tensions and disagreements flaring up in public. One instance is when Jesus tells his disciples to take their message to the Samaritans. Today, the word Samaritan describes a do-gooder, but to a first-century Jew, he was the enemy.
If Jesus told me we had to go through Samaria, my heart would sink. I would say, oh no, we've had hostility between us and the Samaritans for 500 years. And it doesn't look like it's going to get better.
The relationship between Jews and Samaritans was a very difficult one. It seems to have gone back to a problem over what was the proper site for the temple. The Samaritans said that the sacred site should be on their holy mountain, whereas the Jews said that the holy site should be in Jerusalem.
Samaritan villagers were not interested in what these Jewish preachers had to say, and they threw the disciples out. Instead of acting with humility, the disciples were furious. It was a flagrant breach of Jesus' teaching on loving your enemies. James and John were so angry, they wanted to send down fire on the village and obliterate it.
I think today we would see this as a kind of a racism, but it's even more than racism. If you think about what they were really saying, they were saying, let's kill these people.
Whereas Jesus says, no, that's not the way he works. He'll offer them salvation, but if they don't accept it, that's up to them. And he simply goes on to another place.
The disciples were not just at odds with Jesus. On more than one occasion, the Bible says they argue between themselves about which of them is the greatest. James and John even asked Jesus if they can have thrones next to his in the new kingdom.
I think this shows that there's a lot more competitiveness and rivalry between them than we often think. In many ways, this is only to be expected because first-century society was full of squabbles over honour and shame and status. And so in this, the disciples are really just behaving like typical first-century men.
These squabbles may have been typical, but according to psychologist Carey Cooper, they could escalate into damaging power struggles.
We have in almost all groups a James and a John. And the reason I say that is because they're a bit fiery, a bit revolutionary, but I think that they actually kind of want a leadership role. I think they're people who one has to manage quite carefully, otherwise their innate needs for leadership or to be in a position of influence or to be rebellious will get in the way.
The disciples managed to keep their differences in check, most of the time. But on one occasion, these divisions threatened the very survival of the movement. A woman came in and poured expensive perfume over Jesus. The disciples were not impressed.
The disciples are annoyed that this woman has wasted this oil on Jesus. They say she should have taken it away, she should have sold it and given the money to the poor. But Jesus sees things quite differently. He says she's done a beautiful thing.
As treasurer of the group, Judas seems particularly upset by this act. Every group has disagreements, but the consequences of Judas's reaction were catastrophic. The Gospels of Mark and Matthew say Judas goes to the religious authorities to talk about leading them to Jesus. But for now, the other disciples appear to know nothing of Judas's actions. They are excited because after 3 years on the road, their leader has just made a momentous decision. Jesus is about to take his disciples to Jerusalem, the power base of the authorities. At last, they thought, we are about to see some action. They were in for a shock. The disciples entered Jerusalem with Jesus on what's become known as Palm Sunday. Jesus received a rapturous welcome, but it couldn't have come at a more politically sensitive time. Jerusalem was packed with pilgrims come to celebrate the festival of Passover, remembering how Moses had led their ancestors out of captivity in Egypt. According to James Charlesworth, a biblical historian based in Jerusalem, Passover would have prompted the disciples to think about freedom and overthrowing the Romans.
It is a time of great excitement. The Jews are going to celebrate Passover. What does that mean? They are going to reenact and relive God's salvation of his people. So it's a very volatile time. It's a time when everybody is at the peak of excitement.
The highlight of the festival was a shared meal later that same week. But as they settled down to eat what has become known as the Last Supper, Jesus was unusually subdued.
Suddenly, in the midst of the meal, Jesus starts to talk about his death. He picks up the bread and says, "This is my body." He picks up the cup and says, "This is my blood." And he starts talking about doing things in remembrance of him. And I think the disciples must have wondered what on earth he was on about.
It's not clear why the disciples didn't understand what Jesus was talking about. Perhaps all along they had just been waiting for some kind of uprising. The death of their leader was not part of the plan. But what happens next seals their fate. Judas sets off a chain of events that would lead to Jesus' crucifixion. he makes his fatal deal with the authorities. He agrees to betray Jesus. In return, he gets 30 pieces of silver.
If we're right that the piece of silver in question is the Roman and Greek denarius, then he's getting about 30 days' wages in silver. And that happens to be the price in some slave markets for a slave.
Not much for someone who would come to be worshipped as the Son of God. But Judas nonetheless accepts the money. He leads the guards to where he knows the group will be. Suddenly, everything they had worked towards begins to unravel. The disciples panic and lash out.
The disciples are terror-struck. They don't know what to do. Peter's reaction is to draw his sword and to cut off the ear of the high priest's slave. And I think that's quite understandable. They really don't know what's happening. They don't know at that stage whether the arresting party are just going to arrest Jesus or whether they've come for them as well.
In fact, only Jesus is arrested. The disciples themselves scatter.
We have this single line in the Gospels, they all forsook him and fled. And I think we should see this on very human terms. It's nothing very theological or profound. They just got scared and they ran.
All the work of Jesus and the disciples undone by one man's act of treason. But some experts are not so sure that Judas was to blame. A new theory suggests that a fundamental mistake was made in translating the word betray, and that Judas did not in fact betray Jesus. In Greek, the word simply means to hand over. It does not have the more sinister implications of betrayal. Indeed, there's other evidence that Judas was not a traitor. Everyone, including the religious authorities, knew Jesus and where to find him.
What did he betray? Does he betray who Jesus is? Everybody knew who Jesus was. Did he betray where Jesus could be found? It makes the Gospels very clear that he goes to his customary place. So if we're not sure what he betrayed, how could he be called the betrayer?
Certainly when Judas comes with guards to arrest Jesus, his greeting is strange for a traitor, a kiss.
Does a kiss suggest betrayal? In all our ancient sources, Philo, Josephus, and the New Testament, we hear that a kiss means a greeting or a farewell. There's no such thing as a kiss of betrayal.
What's convinced some experts that Judas didn't mean to betray Jesus is his response when he hears that Jesus is to be executed.
He throws the money back at the men. Obviously, something has gone wrong. He then is so disturbed, he goes out and he hangs himself.
But if Judas didn't want to betray Jesus, there still must have been a reason for his deal with the authorities.
I think one thing we could suggest is that he thought this would help Jesus to have the audience with the high priest. This would help the man that could do miracles, even bring people back from the dead, to confront his enemies straight on and establish the kingdom that he so earnestly wanted to establish.
This is a controversial theory, and not everyone is convinced.
There's a certain attractiveness in that, I think, in that it makes what Judas has done more understandable. But I think that's very unlikely. All the Gospels suggest that Judas did betray Jesus for whatever reason, and we'll perhaps never know what that reason was.
Intentionally or not, the fact remains that Judas hastened the death of Jesus. If the disciples had any doubt that Jesus' arrest meant the end of the group, they must have been certain the next day. As their leader was crucified, it isn't clear where the disciples went.
They could have gone to a safe house where they had had the Last Supper. There seems to be some kind of a connection there when they rent that place or arrange for that place. But I think we have to assume that when they fled, they really fled. They wanted to stay out of danger.
The disciples were at their lowest ebb.
This is a critical stage because they've lost their leader. All groups need their leader, and particularly an inspirational leader like Jesus. Very, very critical. There is no real deputy, so that's a bit of a problem. So the group is likely to split up or have enormous difficulties.
With their leader dead, the disciples were left utterly depressed and broken. And yet we know that these forlorn individuals founded what went on to become a major world faith. Clearly something happened to change their fate. Within days of Jesus' execution, there were stories of him rising from the dead. Maybe this was what kept the disciples going.
All the disciples are together again in the upper room. They've got the doors firmly shut because they're worried about the Jewish authorities. And suddenly, Jesus appears in the room and says, "Peace be with you." This, I think, is a significant moment in the gospel story. I think the thing that really differentiates the Jesus movement from similar messianic movements in the first century is they're full of the conviction that their Messiah has survived death. And so this is a symbolic, empowering moment.
This belief that Jesus was still alive was one thing. But if the movement was to continue, they had to convince others that Jesus had risen from the dead. And that wasn't going to be easy. For this reason, many think another event was crucial for the survival of the movement. It's become known as Pentecost, and it took place several weeks after Jesus appeared to the disciples. Since that appearance, they had been spending their time together in prayer.
And something very strange happens to them. They feel this mighty wind rushing through the building. They see the Holy Spirit like little flames of fire resting above each other's heads. And somehow they feel empowered to go out and preach to people. And the amazing thing is that everybody seems to be able to understand their preaching in whatever language they natively speak.
It's this religious event that psychologist Carey Cooper believes transforms the group.
Pentecost, in my view, is the critical event for the group. And the reason it is because they don't have a leader, and the shared experience brings them together. It motivates them. It encourages to go out and preach and to convert people and to share their common experiences. It's a kind of surrogate leadership role.
Before Pentecost, the odds of the disciples founding a new faith were slim. Their different backgrounds, their infighting, and above all, the loss of their leader. It was a remarkable transformation. On the surface, it seemed to be simply a psychological shift, but there may be more to it than that. There is now neurological evidence that religious experience causes a real and quantifiable change in the brain.
Turn it on, just so that we can get the vein for you to put the IV in. Okay, so we don't want you to bend your arm too much because it might it could kink the catheter. Okay, I'm
Professor Andrew Newberg is a neuroscientist at Pennsylvania University. He's been studying the effects of such experiences on Buddhist monks and Catholic nuns.
We had them go through a practice such as meditation or prayer, and at the height of that practice, we would inject them through an intravenous line, a line that was in their vein, with a material that would allow us to measure the blood flow. At the time of the injection, it then is capturing a picture of what her brain is doing at the moment that she is in that heightened state of prayer. We can scan the brain sometime later to see what the snapshot is of what was going on in the brain during that particular practice.
The scan taken during prayer on the right is compared to that of a normal brain, said to be in its baseline state. It recorded a change in the part of the brain that helps us to sense everything around us. This area had less activity during prayer, which showed up as the color yellow. We are not so aware of our surroundings when activity in this part of the brain is reduced and our sense of self lessens. Instead, the mind begins to feel that it's at one with the whole universe. In fact, some people say that's when they become strongly aware of the presence of God.
If they go far enough in their prayer session, then they would lose all sensory information, and we think that this would be associated with a complete blurring of the boundary between the self and God and all things in the world.
Sister Celeste took part in the study. She agrees that she can feel closer to God during prayer.
The experiment shows for me that when we are in religious experience, that there is something happening within us, that within our brain something is being shown.
For the scientists, this experiment means that we have to take seriously the idea that religious experience can cause measurable physiological change.
When we look at the disciples, we can ask the question as to whether or not that transformative spiritual moment actually affected a change in the brain that changed who they were, how they felt, how they thought about everything in their lives, and that that was what changed the direction of what they did.
Certainly after this experience, the disciples were no longer just members of the Jesus movement. They were leaders of a new faith.
It's when they cease being disciples, meaning students, and start being apostles and messengers on their own. And that was the key event for the distinction between the periods.
The disciples must have undergone an incredible personal journey. At the beginning, they were just ordinary, humble fishermen, but by the end of the story, they become leaders of what eventually becomes a world religion.
The disciples don't fit the conventional image of holy men. They were rough and flawed, capable of jealousy, bitterness, selfishness, even violence.
The New Testament makes it very clear these are men of flesh and blood. These are really human people with human wishes. And I find it much more fascinating to realize that they're very much like you and me.